Hey everyone, welcome back to RM Transit. Today we get to talk about a terrible trend in transit that has to do with NIMBYs. If you aren't familiar with NIMBYs, first of all, NIMBYs are people who say, that's a good idea, just keep it away from me, not in my backyard. Today's video is really about how NIMBYs and people with less bad intentions are making transit take so much longer to build and cost so much more than it used to. Let's dive into it. If you're not already, consider supporting the channel on Patreon and YouTube memberships so I can help foil those dastardly NIMBYs and help deliver transit glory for everyone. Okay, maybe not, but I'm gonna do my best. You're probably wondering, is there a reason you're suddenly making a video about NIMBYs and people pushing back against transit? Yes, there is. It seems these days, every direction we look, transit projects and decisions are being pushed and contorted based on the concerns of everyday citizens. Eventually, at some point, you start to wonder, is this reasonable? How is it impacting our transit projects? The reality is, either visibly or invisibly, and either to a large or still fairly large degree, almost all of the expensive transit projects we see out there today have been impacted by NIMBYism or community concerns about the project. Be it the San Jose subway turned escalator showroom, the 2nd Avenue subway, or High Speed 2 in the UK. In particular though, two projects have really caught my eye recently for the great depth they seem to go to avoid any form of concern or opposition about them. And that's why I named the video what I did. It feels like we're entering an era of transit planning, at least in English-speaking countries, where one of the #1 priorities of plans and designs are to make sure that nobody is inconvenienced or even slightly unhappy with construction or the final results of a transit project. Everyone must be extremely supportive and happy about the plans. We also want to make sure that no one is even aware that anything is being built and news reporters never show up on the site with concerns. The first project that really raised my eyebrows is Seattle's Ballard to West Seattle Link Extension program, which includes a new tunnel through Seattle city center. Great, thinking about additional future capacity through the core, I love it. Except several of the stations are being built so deep that they won't be accessible without elevators, right in the downtown core. It's even more stunning because the existing downtown Seattle transit tunnel isn't all that deep. These new stations will be as deep as 50 meters or more. That's as deep as a 15-story building is tall. It's not clear to me whether Sound Transit is intending on building a light rail project here or a gravity elevator to the other side of the planet. We're still, as suggested by writings in The Urbanist, which you should definitely go check out. They have some great stuff on Seattle as well as other places. It doesn't seem like full time to access the platforms has been factored in, including things like people having to wait for crowded elevators. Having to wait for an elevator for 10 minutes in the center of the network where you're supposed to be able to make a convenient transfer sounds like a bad experience, and I definitely suggest us going to take a look at my video on cross-platform transfers for more on how to fix this. Now, why do the stations need to be so deep? Well, for one, it's suggested that the existing light rail tunnel needs to be avoided, and that's totally reasonable. But the depths being gone to seem that the appetite for risk is just unrealistic. This whole trend in North America of, we can't build another tunnel close to an existing tunnel, it's too close, is getting to be way too much. In Europe and Asia, it's not uncommon to have new subway tunnels constructed mere meters away from existing ones, if not centimeters. In fact, when the tunnels were built around the Roman Colosseum, the raw distance between the tunnel and the Colosseum itself was less than 40 meters. So yeah, unless you're trying to protect a landmark which is literally over 1,000 years old, then you probably do not need to be building super deep stuff. In North America, we're putting the better part of a football field between tunnels and new infrastructure, which also doesn't give me much confidence about how well built we think existing tunnels are. It seems another reason for these super deep stations is trying to avoid surface disruption. But in trying to avoid major surface disruption, what we're really doing is creating minor surface disruption for way longer. Essentially, we are taking possibly the same amount of disruption and just spreading it over more time to make it seem like it's less. Now in Toronto, things are arguably even worse. On the Yonge North subway extension, which will take one of North America's most used subway lines north, as it sounds, the choice has been made to deep bore tunnel the line under a wide suburban street, where cut and cover would frankly make a lot of sense for much of its length. In roads of this width in Vancouver, in denser areas with a decent number of high-rises, in fact areas where I may well have lived, and I literally went and measured the width of the roads, Vancouver would just put up a SkyTrain. Meanwhile in Toronto we are burying things deep underground. Now if this wasn't enough, one of the communities on the route, who has for years been pushing for subway access despite its relatively low density, is very upset about a diversion of the subway tunnels under their neighborhood, which will allow the last portion of the subway route to operate on the surface, saving money, at least in theory. Indeed, this is getting to the point of not just not in my backyard, but not under my backyard, not adjacent to my backyard. Worse still, local authorities seem to have shockingly capitulated to these demands, agreeing to push the tunnel up to 50 meters underground, despite they themselves providing very solid evidence that subway trains would be completely imperceptible to even people with superhuman levels of hearing. These tunnels are similarly deep to what Seattle is proposing to build through its downtown core, all so that residents don't have to worry about ever hearing a subway train, even though subway trains are going to go near their homes and benefit them. Even after all of this, likely adding tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars to the project cost, it seems the community still wants their own station, which just blows my mind. Of course, the usual arguments have been made. Tunnels will reduce my property values, even if all of the evidence that I have ever seen suggests that access to a subway in Toronto will increase your property value. As it turns out too, these homes already have tunnels underneath them. How else would they get sewer and utility services, for example? Now, you might be playing devil's advocate here. Should we not be trying to reduce disruption? And I will get to that. But at what point do we draw the line? At some point, people can't expect the transit and infrastructure of a large city, but not put up with any of the effects, positive or negative, of that transit. Worse still is preventing everyone else along a transit line from getting better transit service, whether they actually need it beyond just increasing their property values or not, because you don't feel your concerns are adequately met. Of course, it isn't just local communities, and frankly, even if I find these arguments deeply unreasonable, I get it. People are not wrong to be concerned about major infrastructure that they're not familiar with being built near their homes. That is completely normal, to be honest. Part of the project is that on almost every level, we make things seem worse and riskier than they actually are, and we don't sell the benefits of projects well enough. We also don't put responsibility in the right places so that decisions can be made without being swayed by people's concerns, whether they're reasonable or not. For example, the media, as helpful as it can be, doesn't always help with the perception of construction. Toronto's Eglinton Avenue has had a subway being built under it for the better part of a decade. And while parts of it are admittedly a real pain to walk around, and I've walked up and down Eglinton a ton over the past several years, the truth is, if you only listen to news reports about the area, you'd think it is way worse than it actually is. Are there a few places where it is a bit nonsensical and where it's a bit of a pain to have to go around construction fencing? Absolutely. But on the whole, it's an okay environment to be, especially considering what's being built. It's annoying, but it's also a subway that's going to last over 100 years, so we kind of have to expect that there will be some level of interruption to daily activities. There's also a perception that infrastructure projects are worse than they really are, because as with most things, we usually hear from the loudest and most outspoken critics. Most people just slightly annoyed on their commute aren't going to show up at a meeting yelling and complaining. And that's something we have to more broadly understand. Just because people are complaining about something doesn't mean they're actually representative of what the general population thinks. The reality of public consultation processes as they're designed is that it often distributes unfair weight to people who have a lot of time on their hands to show up to things like public meetings. And often these aren't the disadvantaged people who transit is most critical to serving, and the people who are most likely to actually feel the brunt of bad construction and bad design of transit alignments and the like. Perhaps the most concerning part about all of this, though, is that we've gone beyond just having people come to meetings and complain. Transit agencies in North America are so used to NIMBYism that they're starting to jump the gun and design projects in a way that kind of assumes that people are going to be up in arms from day one, without even testing the waters to see what people might actually just be willing to accept. What this leads to is projects that are proposed to be deep underground from day one, like most in Toronto. It's often taken as a given that anything but a completely imperceptible tunnel will arouse too much negative attention and potentially bad press. This has been tested in an interesting way though. In Toronto, it used to be kind of the accepted belief that people would just never accept an elevated transit line. I've been in many conversations where I suggested maybe we should just do elevated, and people would say,
no one will ever accept that in this neighborhood.
and maybe that's true, but Toronto's first major elevated transit line, while it is getting pushback, isn't getting pushback for being elevated. And what this tells us is that maybe people just don't care as much as we think they do about these things, especially if they can be brought into the planning process from an early stage so that they can feel they had a real part to play and that they're benefiting as a community. Often people just really want to be heard. Imagine if in this case we had just assumed that no one would accept anything but a tunnel. We might have built a tunnel and people would probably be fine with it, though some would probably still inevitably complain about some element of the project, but we would have spent tons of money that could be used for other valuable stuff. So what's the solution to all of this? For one, we need to communicate how changes to projects impact their costs and timelines. People often don't see that trade-off on the level of we need to bury this line or we need to not elevate this line. If we said putting this line underground here is going to cost the same as 30 new schools in your community, or the same as a brand new hospital, people might start to be a bit more reasonable about the trade-off of burying versus keeping something above ground. Presenting the impacts of putting a line deeper underground is important because otherwise it's just money coming from the government paying to make the transit line better. There's no real cost to a local community. In addition, I think a lot of community members could often be brought on side if you explain to them that deeper construction means construction will have to go on for a lot longer. So while again you might see less disruption, people are going to be down your street for years more than they would be otherwise. There's another issue, and it's political. It's not really partisan politics, so I'm willing to dive into it a bit in this video. The issue is really one of responsibility. Local politicians are put in a weird place with transit projects, and this is part of why I think you can't have an entirely locally controlled transit project, especially one that's major and potentially disruptive. The reason is that local politicians feel a ton of pressure from local communities to build something which might meet the needs of a local community by, say, being deep underground, but which doesn't meet the needs of the city and society at large by providing affordable transit that's easy to access. To some extent, I think local politicians need to be insulated from local concerns. Of course, local politicians should be able to hear the concerns of their local communities, but they shouldn't be able to directly impact projects so that every single neighborhood gets every single thing that they want. If you plan in this way, you get a transit line that along its entire length works super hard not to annoy anyone, but at the same time it doesn't do a good job of serving the city at broad that it's actually supposed to serve. At the same time, it has to be clear where you draw the line. I remember going to a public consultation at one point where residents who were living right next to a major new transit line were complaining that a transformer to power said new electric transit line was going to risk exposing them to massive amounts of electromagnetic radiation. When arguments like this come up, not only is it incredibly important to just state the facts that this is not the case and that people need to understand that electrical infrastructure is all around us, because this can lead to people getting scared of things they shouldn't be scared of, but at the same time it has to be clear immediately that there are certain things that just aren't negotiable. You want electric transit, you need electric transit infrastructure. It's also important to recognize that in many cases, if you give an inch on things like this, well, you know what happens. So, breaking down the cases I talked about at the beginning of this video, I think in Seattle's case, the obvious answer is that the new tunnel should probably start its design from its intersection point with the existing line. Getting that interface to be as small as possible should be the #1 goal of the project, since interfacing between the two major transit lines is probably the most important thing this new downtown tunnel is going to do. From there, the tunnel can be worked backwards out from this intersection point, which should be, again, as small as possible, trying to keep the line as shallow as it reasonably can be. And it being shallow and easily accessible should be the #1 priority of design, not minimizing disruption. The reality of locating in a big, fast-growing city is that you have to accept major infrastructure is going to be built. That's exactly how the city became big, and that's exactly how it stays successful. I don't think it's fair for anyone who locates themselves in a downtown area to expect anything less than major infrastructure coming around now and again. People who are truly disadvantaged, they should be compensated. But in general, you need to look at how people will be benefiting and how they'll be impacted. There's often this attitude too of things being technically very difficult, but the reality is that in other places, the same things are done. we have to realize that everything is kind of a trade-off. In some places, a higher priority is put on transit, and so more engineering challenges are taken. At the end of the day, it seems like in Seattle, instead of taking on engineering challenges, instead they're simply being avoided. And again, that shows that transit isn't really a priority. Toronto's case is more tricky. While I think going under homes is honestly fine, it's already something that's done in a number of places throughout the city without any major issues, I think at the same time, this wouldn't really be an issue if the line was cut and cover from day one. Now, to be clear, there are sections of this line which would be difficult to cut and cover, but there are different approaches which could be taken. And fundamentally, if the line was cut and cover, then it might not cost as much, and diverting it to the surface rail corridor wouldn't feel as much like a necessity. We also have to ask ourselves, are people having to put up with a bit of traffic for a few years, or people having to deal with some noise and vibration? Are those trade-offs worth building less transit? It might seem like it because people will be upset, but you have to remember that no one's able to advocate for transit they don't have yet. It's also very hard to communicate the scale of the benefits a transit line provides. Hundreds of thousands of people moved by it, tons of cars off the road, way less greenhouse gas emissions, better health for everyone. These are fantastic benefits, but they just don't compare to someone yelling or complaining or bringing up concerns that feel very real to you. Planners and transit agencies have to understand the weight of the importance of building transit in our cities, especially decisions which make it harder and more expensive to build transit. Because if transit is important to us, and if we believe we need to live in a world with more transit, we're going to have to build a lot more of it. Thanks for watching.